The session is entitled Rendering Synthetic Objects into Real Scenes, Bridging Traditional and Image-Based Graphics with Global Illumination and High Dynamic Range Photography. The author is Paul Debevec, who's a research scientist at the University of California at Berkeley.
Great, thanks very much, Julie, and hello. So this talk is about two things. First of all, trying to take synthetic objects and render them into real scenes, and also to try to provide something of a framework for taking traditional graphics and image-based graphics and using them together. There's two motivations for this work. The first of all is an image-based modeling and rendering. We know with all of the recent results that have been achieved that we can take real scenes, get them into the computer, and then render them photorealistically. But we'd also like to be able to manipulate these scenes to, for example, add new objects, populate them with new buildings, furniture, and people. And if we do this, we're going to need the lighting to be correct. And we're going to need these objects to cast appropriate shadows and reflections in the scene. As it turns out, this problem is very much related to a problem faced all the time in the movie industry, which is for combining computer graphic elements and background plates when they want to add synthetic actors, oftentimes dinosaurs and props to film. You want to be able to do this photorealistically with the correct lighting and correct highlights, and also get the correct shadows in the scene. However, the current techniques for doing that are somewhat challenging to use, so I have a little review of them. First of all, the things that you need to match up in order to get a computer graphic element and a background plate to look like they really belong together, there's a large number of them. I'll only be speaking about the illumination, but these also involve the camera parameters, the film response, film grain, even the modulation transfer function of the lens should be matched. But today I'll be discussing work that relates to matching the illumination between the actual scene and the synthetic objects. So the current techniques for doing this, one of them is to survey the light source positions of the actual set where you're going to try to place your synthetic objects into. And then in your computer-generated world, place synthetic lights in hopefully the same positions, and then adjust their intensities and colors manually, possibly adding other lights as well, to get a consistent look for your synthetic objects in the scene. There's actually some work, 4893, that showed if you just know where the lights are and you assume the scene is diffuse and you have a model of it, you can calculate the intensities of the light sources automatically. Another technique is to use a reference object. You'll place, say, either a gray ball or even a shiny ball in the scene, take a look at how the light reflects off of that, and use that as a qualitative guide in your computer-generated world to make sure that your new objects look consistent with the way that the reference objects did. There's a very significant technique called environment mapping, which was shown in Blinn and Newell 1976, where if you are able to render a full view panorama at the position of where your new object should go, you can then use the surface normals of the object to index into this full view panorama to grab pixel values. You can also do this with photographs, and there was a number of pieces of work in the 80s that showed how this could be done. And this technique works extremely well for shiny objects, and there's also certain techniques that can be used to do less shiny materials. But it's most known for producing things such as specular reflections. It doesn't, however, make it possible to cast shadows into the scene or have the object reflect itself in the proper ways. So generally what actually goes on is a combination of all of these techniques where you'll use environment mapping to some degree for the specular reflections, and then you'll manually move light sources around and adjust them until the look is correct. Achieving realism in this manner is quite difficult. However, it is possible, and there's a number of examples that we've seen recently where people who are very talented and have the time to spend to do this can achieve excellent results. But what we'd like to do is have techniques that are somewhat more automatic. So our approach is going to be to illuminate synthetic objects with measurements of real light, actually using the real light in the scene to illuminate the synthetic objects. Now to do this, we need to be able to measure that, and the standard device for measuring it is going to be a camera. However, is a camera useful for measuring light? Well, let's take a cue from environment mapping and place a shiny curved object in the scene to acquire an environment map and take a look at it. So this is an environment map taken inside a kitchen environment. The shiny ball was placed just above the table, which you can see down here, reflected in most of the ball. This is the camera way back here. And what you can see is that you see the entire scene, actually not just half of it, but really just about all of the entire scene except what's directly behind the ball. And it tells you basically what all of the illumination is, sort of. If you take a look at the major sources of light in this scene, there's two of them. One of them is an incandescent lamp in the ceiling, and another one is the windows here, which open up to a clear sky. You'll see that these are saturated out to white. They've hit the maximum value of 255 in the image. And that actually makes it impossible to tell what color these light sources are really, or how really bright they are. So if you're going to use the lighting information that you recorded, you have to have that information there. And a technique that you can use to recover that is something that was presented last year, in which you take a series of photographs from long exposures to short exposures, so that in any particular part of the scene will neither be completely black or completely saturated in all of the photographs. And then you can combine this series of photographs into something called a radiance map. And the radiance map can have very high dynamic range. This particular one is about 300,000 to 1 between the brightest reliable measurement and the lowest reliable measurement. And these values are actually proportional to real light. So let's take a radiance map of that mirrored ball. We're going to see it displayed here in 3 different ways, because this is a low dynamic range display device. We actually used 10 photographs of the ball from 1/4 to 1/10,000th of a second in order to assemble this radiance map. And you can see the radiance values that we get. In these versions here, for example, the table, the values are around 50. But if you stare straight into the light sources, you can see that you have much brighter values on the order of 10,000. Just as important, you can see that you have the real colors of the light sources. So this one here is actually significantly blue, and this one here, a tungsten lamp, is significantly reddish yellow. So it's important to get all of this information, because the large areas of indirect light and the concentrated areas of direct light are going to have, both of them, significant contributions to the lighting in your scene. So how do you illuminate a synthetic object with this technique? It's actually quite easy using global illumination. And it's particularly easy if you use Greg Larson's radiance system. There's a website, it's publicly available. There's also a new book on using it available. What you can do is take your object and then place those light readings, effectively texture mapping them in a high dynamic range way onto a large surrounding surface, and then just tell the radiance system to calculate the illumination. And it will then, for every point on the object, look at what amount of light is illuminating it from whatever directions are relevant for that object's material property, and produce renderings. And those look something like this. So in the upper left, we're seeing a shiny object, and then there's some other material properties. The upper left is actually pretty similar to the reflection mapping case. Of course, since we're doing a full lighting simulation, you can see that the object reflects itself. You can see that the bright windows are over here, and again, they're saturated in this rendering because we're seeing this on a low dynamic range display device. This is a gold material property which starts to blur some of those high dynamic range values a bit. Now you can really tell that the reflections in the table are somewhat darker than the windows themselves, whereas you can't really tell that in this image. And then these are 2 objects that have significant diffuse properties. This is actually a purely diffuse object, and you can see that those windows are actually casting shadows on the object itself. These are the 2 major sources of windows, and you're getting these nice soft shadows as a result. You're also getting a slight color change toward the inner lip of the object, where you're blocking the bluish windows and only being illuminated by the yellowish tungsten lamp. And then this is a plastic object, which also shows shadows and makes it possible to see the colors of the light sources reflected in the somewhat muted specular reflection. So just to show how important it is to use the high dynamic range radiance maps, I have a comparison. This is the object illuminated with the radiance map, and this is that same matte diffuse object illuminated with just a single image. First of all, the single image here misses most of the light because it's been clipped off. And you can see how much is really missed by just how dark this rendering is. Now I can take the right half of this rendering and then just pump it up so that we can compare it qualitatively in a more direct way to this image. And we'll see that even if you just increase the brightness, it doesn't work. In fact, the color of the object is wrong because we've lost the color of the light sources, and we're not getting shadows because we don't know that those lights are actually bright and should be casting shadows. This is a collection of objects illuminated with this same environment radiance map. And it's fun to look at all the different material properties at the same time, because just in one picture you can see the full dynamic range of the scene. This is showing the saturated values, and you can also see the environment. If you look into this black ball, well, it's got a muted specular reflection, so you can see the light sources and such. You're also getting all the correct global illumination effects of objects casting reflections in each other. And this ball here is glass, and it's actually casting caustics onto the table. We can also show this lit with a different environment map. This one was taken on an overcast day outside below a trellis, and so you can see the pattern of the trellis and the specular reflections, and you can see it gives you a very different quality of light. So at this point, we can now illuminate synthetic objects with real light, but how do we add synthetic objects to a real scene? Well, in order to do that, they're going to have to photometrically interact with the real scene. So here's our example scene. It's the kitchen table again. And these are all real objects that have been placed on the table. We'd like to add some synthetic objects here. So first of all, we're going to measure what the illumination is like in this area. And to do that, we can place the mirrored ball as a light probe to try to figure out what the illumination is. And then this is the calibration grid, which is going to tell us what the camera pose is. So in order to run a global illumination solution that's going to give us the right answer, we have to bring the real world to some extent into the computer. So this is the real world, and we're going to get this into the computer, but of course we don't want to have to get a complete material-based model of the entire scene that's completely geometrically accurate, and we won't have to. So let's model this room as, say, just the rectangle above the table here. And what we're going to do is create an image-based model of it based on the measurements from the probe. However, I'm going to refer to this as a light-based model to differentiate it in that the values that we will have in the model are not pixel values to be displayed on a screen directly, rather they are real measurements of real light. And so that can be mapped on in this manner. If this is where the probe was, then you just map the stuff off using the reflection angle. So the result of creating this light-based model looks like this. These here are the various sides of the model. The windows are over here on this wall. This is the incandescent lamp. These are some cabinets. And then on the bottom face, since that was coincident with the plane of the table, you can actually see the table here. Toward the back is where you get the stretched sampling, because the edge of the ball samples very anisotropically. Luckily, there aren't any concentrated sources of light there, so this poor sampling behind isn't going to make much difference in our final renderings. So now we need to set up a global illumination calculation. So we have our light-based model of the scene. To this, we can add some synthetic objects, which we'll place right here. If we just ran our global illumination solution at this point, it would correctly have light come from the light-based model and illuminate the synthetic objects, but it wouldn't make it possible for the objects to affect the scene. We want shadows and reflections. So what we'll do is we'll delete part of the light-based model and replace it with something that we'll call our model of the local scene. And our local scene model, which is just going to be a square of table underneath the objects, its job is going to be affected by the objects. So for this, we're going to need an estimate of its material properties. This is how the illumination calculation works. Light is going to come from the light-based model of the scene to the synthetic objects, and also from the light-based model of the scene to the local scene. Light will be able to pass between the local scene and the synthetic objects so that you get correct interreflections there. But any light reflected back to the distant part of the light-based model is not going to have any effect, because we don't know anything about the material properties of this. So that light will be ignored. Now that's actually a good thing, because that means our computation will be a lot more efficient, since we don't have to do any global illumination calculations for these parts of the scene. Instead, all of the global illumination will be focused on the local scene and the synthetic objects. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Here's our background plate, and on the next slide I'm going to take our renderings of the synthetic objects and the local scene matched geometrically to this camera position. And that looks like this. So we can see that the objects are reflecting the environment correctly and are illuminated consistently with the other objects, but there's a significant problem here. It has to do with the local scene. The local scene, we just have an estimate of what its material properties are. In this case, it's just been a single color polygon. So it misses the grain of the table, for example. That's one reason that it's obvious. The other reason is that our light-based model of the room isn't quite correct. It doesn't know that this white object actually sticks up off the table, so it has no way of knowing that the local scene should be reflecting that object right there. So the local scene covers up part of the reflection, and that doesn't look very realistic. So because we only have an estimate of the material properties of the local scene, we'd like to have some way of not having that affect our rendering so badly. And what we can do is something called differential rendering. What we'll do is take the local scene and render it in exactly the same way, except without the synthetic objects in the calculation. So this is what the local scene looks like, illuminated by the light-based model, but without any synthetic objects. What we can then do is compare the appearance of the local scene without the objects here to the appearance of it with the objects, which have the shadows and reflections, and subtract the two. And this gives you a difference image, and it's going to be dark wherever there were shadows, and light wherever there was reflected light, or in this case, a caustic. If we combine these images, take the background plate, copy the objects in as they were rendered in this image, and then just apply this difference to the local scene, we get this result. You can see now that the local scene tends to blend in very well with the rest of the environment, because only its change from the rest of the scene has been rendered with its estimate of the material properties. So the reflection is now preserved, and it's difficult to see the edge. Let's zoom in on this a little bit. There are some rendering artifacts I'd like to show right here. First of all, because of the stochastic nature of the rendering algorithm, we're getting a somewhat speckled reflection of these bright areas of the ball in the table. That could be fixed if we let the thing run and render for longer. And I should point out that this edge back here is actually a real break in the table where you pull it apart to put the leaf in. The edge of the local scene is actually right in front of it about here. And as it turns out, the local scene did end a little bit too early, so the shadows of the objects from the windows get cut off a bit. So the local scene should have been larger, or we could have feathered out its influence for a better result. So in order to get good renderings, though, even with the differential rendering method, you should have as close a model of the material properties of the local scene as you can to get the correct shadows and reflections. So the paper talks about ways of doing that, and it shows that for each part of the local scene, because we have a light-based model of the environment, we know what its irradiance is. That is, we know the intensity and directions of all the light that are illuminating it. If the local scene, if you just assume it's diffuse, well, then its albedo, its diffuse color is just its radiance divided by its irradiance. So you can figure out diffuse colors directly using this method. The non-diffuse properties can be estimated using iterative methods or by hand, and we discuss those in the paper. And there's also other work that we cite here for recovering material properties, one of which is going to be the last talk in this session. So some future work, we'd like to do a better job of recovering material properties, which actually basically means taking a light-based model of the scene and converting it into a traditional material-based model of the scene. And this can probably be done by observing it in different lighting conditions and from different viewpoints. We like to improve the efficiency of our renderings. These are global illumination calculations, so they're not particularly efficient by default. One way to do that would be to pre-process the light-based model to figure out where the concentrated sources of light are so that you can simulate those in a forward rather than a backward manner. And lastly, we'd like to apply this to animation to get as efficient results as possible using the results of this solution on one frame to drive the computation for the next frame instead of computing the entire illumination solution from scratch. And there's some related work by Debevec, 97, in which he showed for diffuse scenes a way in which this can be done very efficiently. At this point, I'd like to show some video. First thing we'll see is just the synthetic objects being illuminated by the distance scene model, by the light-based model. So there's some speckling from the global illumination. And we're not doing any differential rendering here. We're just looking at the objects as they're illuminated by the model. No synthetic light sources were used. This is the different scene, or same scene with the overcast environment. You get a different quality of light on things. This next video is going to show some post-processing that you can do for fun. It's going to show the kitchen environment with some strange objects. We're doing some duotone mapping, some image defocus, and light fall off toward the corners of the image in order to produce an effect. This next is an excerpt from Rendering with Natural Light. Everything in this scene is synthetic except the environment itself. See in a moment, this is the environment radiance map that was used to produce these renderings. It was taken in the eucalyptus grove on the UC Berkeley campus. It was actually taken from 2 images of the light probe so that you could get good sampling all the way around. It's a little bit of image defocus there. So you get kind of a soft focus effect. These are some renderings that were done by Sun Chang and Christine Wagoner, who are undergraduate summer students. Christine is from Brown University. And it is an animation. We got the animation data from the Impulse Dynamic Simulator by Brian Mirtik and John Canny. And thanks to some people at Brown who helped us render this. So we're going to render this with differential rendering, and we're going to go back to the kitchen. The moving stuff is synthetic. Also, the spheres, every sphere in there is synthetic. See this at half speed. The dominoes are casting the correct soft shadows, and all of the shadows should be consistent with the rest of the things that you see in the environment. In particular, this is real. These are synthetic, synthetic, real, synthetic, synthetic. So let me quickly conclude. The first thing, shown that measurements of real light can be used to illuminate synthetic objects. Shown that you can actually set up a global illumination computation in which you partition the scene into the distant areas, the local areas, and then the synthetic objects themselves in order to compute the interaction between all of these components. We've presented a differential rendering method that adds the shadows and reflections and caustics into the scene, even if the material property estimates that you have for your local scene aren't quite accurate. We've shown that measurements of real scene radiance are very useful in determining material properties of parts of a scene. And lastly, we've shown that constructing light-based models of a scene rather than image-based models of a scene can be very helpful if you want to manipulate the scene later, because you actually have readings of how much light was coming from any particular direction at any particular point in space, rather than just what color things should be if you want to make a picture of them. So, thank you very much.
We have time for one question. Can we bring up the house lights?
Yeah, sorry. What sort of rendering times did it take?
Okay. The rendering times are exactly what we would get using basically a scene of that similar complexity with the radiance system. You have to let things run reasonably long if you're not identifying the sources of light beforehand, because for every particular part of the scene, when you get a diffuse calculation, it has to send out rays to go looking for light. And we have to have a reasonably large number of rays for that. So images of about that quality can be done in about somewhere around 10 minutes a frame. Obviously, it helps a lot if you render all the frames at the same time using different computers, which is what we did to produce those final animations.
The final paper in the session is Recovering Photometric Properties of Architectural Scenes from Photographs. The authors are Yizhu Yu and Jitendra Malik, both from the University of California at Berkeley.